Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, and thank you for watching IT Pro TV, helping you learn everywhere you go. I'm your host, Zach Memis, for this episode of CompTIA Linux Plus. And this episode is Managing Groups. And the one and only Don Pizzetta is here because he's a heck of a guy. Don, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. And, in this episode, we're going to take a look at groups, which are a great way to be able to collect users together. And once we do that, we can assign things like permissions. We set permissions once on the group as opposed to on each individual user, which would be a lot of work. So we're going to see how to create those groups right here, as well as how to manipulate them, change them, and how Linux sees them on the back end. So that's all what's coming up right here in this episode.
So, Don, what command do we use to create groups?
Well, nice thing about this is if you watched our episode on users, you pretty much take the same commands, and anywhere where the word user appeared, you just switch it out to group. So we had user add before, now we have group add, or user mod becomes group mod. So that makes life pretty easy. In fact, if we want to get in and create our first group, we can see how easy it is. I'm going to drop down here to my terminal. And let's say I want to create a group for all of my salespeople, right? I could just come in and say group add sales, right? Oops. You do have to be an administrator to add groups. So I got a permission deny there. I need to do a sudo on that one. And once I authorize and authenticate, there we go. Now I've created a group called sales, and I can go on and continue to add more groups. You can actually do them from the same line if you want. You can add more than one group at the same time. So I could create marketing and accounting and all those other ones and get them put in place. But that group add command is what does it. And we saw in the last episode the /etc/group file. And if we take a tail of it and look at the end of it, we should see that we now have a group called sales right there. It got group ID 1006 for me. And so that group is now created. So as far as getting a group created, it's pretty straightforward, just group add.
Are we able to modify a group once it's created?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll stick with the same advice I gave in the last episode, which is if you just created it, you could always delete it and recreate it. But in the example of a user, there's a lot of extra stuff that you set, like a full name and a password and so on. On a group, we don't really set that stuff. It's really just a name. So if you want to change the name of a group, you could delete this one, right, by using group del or group delete, and then create a new one. That would work fine. But if it's already got a bunch of people in it, we don't want to do that, right? Because when you delete one group and create a new one, nobody's in it. We'd have to re-add all the users to it. So if I want to change the name, I can actually use the group mod command. So if I do a group mod, and actually I'm going to remember to sudo this one, we can do a group mod. And, I capitalized sales when I created that one. So let's say that I did a group add and I created marketing and I forgot to capitalize the M. And it's driving me nuts, right? In Linux, it's case sensitive and I want them to be capitalized. I could come back in and just do a group mod. And group mod has a number of different command line flags to it. But the main one that we're going to use is changing the name, which is -N. It's a little bit weird because when we changed a user's name, it was -L, so that the flags aren't identical between the two commands, but you can only ask for so much. So I'm going to do -N, and then what I want the new name to be, I want the new name to be capitalized, all right? So I'll do a capital M this time and specify the old name where it's lowercase. And when I run that, it's going to change the name so that it is now capitalized. And if I tail the /etc/group file, I should see that marketing is indeed capitalized right there. And so I know that it's updated and it's in business. And more importantly, if there were 15 people in that group, they would still be in it. If I had done group del marketing, deleted it and made a new one, all those people would have been kicked out.
How do we put user accounts into the groups, Don?
All right. What I've done so far, I've created the groups, right? I've done what I needed to do, but they're not incredibly useful right now because nobody's in them. So unless we put people in the groups, they're useless. Now, we have to be careful with this. With Linux users, they have a primary group and then they have secondary groups, all right? When you create a user, a primary group is created with the same user's name. So if I created a JDoe user account, there's a JDoe group that's created, and that's that user's primary group. So that's kind of the way that works. And if I do a ID command, I'm going to ID the JDoe account that we made in the last episode. So when I look at John Doe, I can see that he's user ID 1003, and then his primary group ID is 1003 also. That's his primary group. And then you have secondary groups, other groups that he might be a member of, okay? You can only have one primary, but you can have a ton of secondaries. So when we create groups for use in our company, like sales and marketing and so on, I usually want those to be a secondary group of the user, not their primary, right? Although in some scenarios, maybe you want that, but a lot of times it would be as a secondary group. So if we want to set somebody to be in a secondary group, there's a few ways to do it. The easiest way, in my opinion, is to use the gpasswd command. All right. Now, passwd is the command we use to set passwords for our users, right? But gpasswd is the group password command. We don't normally set passwords for our groups, although you could, but it also allows you to add users to the group. And that's what I want to do. I'm going to say -A, so I'm adding a user, and I want to add John Doe to the sales group. So I'll type in JDoe and then just sales. So I'm going to add them into the sales. And see, adding user JDoe to group sales. So they've been moved in there. I could then come back and take, we'll do Jane Smith, and actually I'll put her in marketing. And let's see, what other users do I have? Zach, you're going to go in sales today.
Oh.
So you're going to start an all new career. So we'll take Zach and throw him into sales. Each time, just doing that sudo gpasswd -A followed by the user. And I could actually do more than one user if I was adding a bunch of people. And then the group name needs to be last. All right. So that's putting each one of them into those groups. And I can verify they're in there by using the ID command. So if I sudo ID Zach, for example, and take a look, see how his primary group is still the Zach group, right? That's his primary. But the secondaries, it lists your primary a second time. It is the same because you see the same ID. But then I see that he's in Zach as well as sales. He's in two different groups. And I could check each of the other people like JDoe and so on and see that they're now in these respective groups. And if I change my mind, like maybe Zach gets a promotion, and so we're going to move him from sales over to marketing, right? Well, I want to take him out of sales and put him into marketing. Well, sticking him into marketing is easy enough, right? I do the same thing that I did before, like that, adding user by using that gpasswd -A. And if I look at his account, I can see that now he's in sales and marketing, right? So I need to take him out of sales because I moved him over to marketing. So if I want to do that, it's the same basic command to take somebody out, except instead of -A for add, it's going to be -D for delete. So I'm just going to do -D, and we just removed Zach from the sales group. And if we look at his account now, I can see he's in marketing. So easy enough to kind of flip somebody around, move them from one group to another, and so on. Now, each time I modified this group, I had to do it, I had to sudo, right? I had to be an administrator to make that change. But let's say that Zach's not just going into marketing, he's the new marketing manager. So he's going to be in charge of the whole marketing department. So maybe I want to allow Zach to administer the group so that he can put people into the marketing department on his own. Now, I will tell you, this is probably one of the least used features on the planet because end users are not good at managing Linux groups, right? But if you want, you could make somebody an administrator of the group. The main reason I want to point it out here is that the way you do it, remember when I added Zach to the group, I used -A and it was a lowercase a. If you make that a capital A, that's not just going to add him to the group. It's going to make him an administrator of the group. Okay. So now he's allowed to put people in or take people out of that group, all just by changing the case of a letter. So it's really important when you type these commands that you pay attention to that. The lowercase command is normally what we want. In this case, the uppercase command would give out a decent bit of authority that we might not be intending to do.
Are secondary group permissions applied automatically?
Sort of.
Okay, good answer.
Actually, a lot of times they aren't, right? In our, we'll do an episode on file permissions a little bit later, but when we define a file, you always define a user, a group, and an other, right? So a user will have certain access to a file. A group, which will usually be a person's primary group, may have access to a file, and then other would be everything else. Well, that other being everything else is kind of a problem. What if a file is set up where the marketing department should have write access to it, and your group, you have marketing, but it's a secondary group? That's not going to catch, not going to apply. So what happens is when a user is working in the file system, if they want to take advantage of their secondary groups, they have to temporarily change that to be their primary, to say I'm acting as that group, okay? Let me give you an example. Let's do this. I'm going to put myself into a couple of groups here. So I'm going to do gpasswd-a, or I don't need to be an administrator. And I'm going to add myself to marketing, and I'll do the same thing to sales. All right, so I'm going to be in those two groups. All right, so my user account is now in those groups. I'm going to need to log out and log back in of my shell, or just close it and open it. If I was in an actual CLI, I'd need to log out, log back in. So that the groups take effect, I will just ID myself here to make sure that I am showing as being in marketing and sales now. Perfect. Okay, so I'm in these different ones. My primary group is dpossess. If I create a file, like I'm just going to do touch file1.txt, okay? And I'll do an ls-la. Oops, let me change that so that we just see test star. Whoops, what did I call that? Oh, I called it file1. Let me pull up the right thing here. There we go. There's file1. So see how the user is dpossess, and then the group is dpossess also. That's my primary group, right? So the primary group is what kicks in by default. If I want to operate as marketing for a little while, what I need to do is use the new group command like that. New group says I'm going to change my group context for a moment. I'm going to change mine to marketing, okay? I didn't really get any feedback there, right? I just typed new GRP marketing. But I'm going to create another file here. I'll create, let's do file2. Let's just touch file2.txt like that. And then I'm going to do a new GRP sales. So changing that context one more time, and I'll touch file3.txt. All right. Now I'm going to do an ls-la of file star and look at the files. The first one I created had my primary. The second one actually shows marketing, and the third one shows sales. I changed my group context to operate in that role. And so that's something that a user would have to do to take advantage of the secondary groups. They're in the group. That's what enables them to change that context. If they weren't in the marketing group and they typed new GRP marketing, it would have failed. They're not in the group. But I changed my context, and now I am, and I'm able to perform operations. That's really important to make sure that files get the right ownership, because otherwise you got to go in and change things. So for example, the file I made earlier that's owned by the dpossess group, if I want sales to have access to it, I would have to come in and change that. I could do chgrp to change the group of that file, or you can do chown to change the owner. Both commands actually work kind of the same way. We'll see them in the permissions episode. So I might want to change the owner to be like dpossess:"marketing for file1.txt. Okay. And when I do that and take a look at the files, I can see that group is now flagged as marketing, but I have to remember to do it. If I just change my group context, now I'm operating in that role, and I can edit files and change them or whatever within that marketing group. So it's not as automatic as it probably should be, but once you switch that context, then it is automatic until you need to change back out again. And as far as changing back out, if I want to get back to my primary, well, I'm going to need to do a new GRP and switch back to that dpossess context so I'm back into my own group. So it's a little bit tricky sometimes to remember all the stuff that's going on. In fact, as a user, you might not even know all of the groups that you're in. And in the last episode and in this episode, I've been using the ID command. The ID command is really cool because you can see everything that somebody is in, but it's designed for administrators, right? So if I do ID Zach like that, well, shoot, I am an administrator, darn it. For a regular user, though, a lot of times they'll just get an error on that. They won't be able to see that command or, that output. So there is another command you can run, which is the groups command. And when you run groups, let me pull up the man page for that real quick. What you'll see is groups followed by username, and the username is optional because if you just type groups and press enter, you'll see the groups that you're in. So any user can type groups and they see the groups they're in, and now they know, oh, I can use new GRP and switch to any one of these contexts and start to work in that way. Or I can say groups followed by another user, and assuming I have permissions, I'll see what they have. I can see Zach is in marketing. Now, doing it that way, that's the easy way, using the groups command. We also have like the actual files where this stuff is stored. We can take a look at like the actual /etc folder. If you look in, well, if we look in /etc/passwd, you don't actually see much in the way of groups here. So for example, with Zach, I see his user ID and his primary group ID, but it's the number of that primary group ID. I probably don't have all of those group IDs memorized, so I don't know what group that is. But if we look in /etc/group, inside of that one, things are spelled out a little more clearly. And right here, I can see in the sales group is John Doe and Dee Pizzette. And in the marketing group, there's Jane Smith, Zach, and Dee Pizzette. Each of these users showing up. And so now we can kind of get a view there as well. So, a few different ways to be able to validate whether those groups exist and how they're configured.
Are there any other ways to verify a group's configuration?
There is another command. As far as like just looking at raw group configuration, that's kind of the main thing. The groups command is what I usually use because it's so easy and you don't have to be an administrator to do it. So that's always nice. But there is another command I mentioned in the last episode but didn't show called getEnt, right? I keep tailing these etc folders and files that are in there, right? Which is fine, except tail returns the last 10 rows by default. If I added more than 10 users, I wouldn't see them all, and I'd have to expand out the range, and you end up with a lot of stuff in there. If there's 1,000 users, tail's not so effective anymore. Now I've got to grep it and all that. Well, there's another command called getEnt or getEntity, and it's a really neat command. Let me just do a man getEnt. And what you'll see is it says get entries from name service switch libraries or NSS libraries. NSS libraries are actually for domain lookups, right? Which is used for, not DNS, this was actually used back for NIS Plus, a directory service that's not really popular anymore. But the getEnt command can actually be used to find information inside of the /etc/group and /etc/passwd files as well. And so you can quickly locate a user and their configuration. So for example, if I want to learn more about Zach, I could come in and say getEnt passwd and then Zach. And it's going to automatically look into the /etc/passwd, and it's going to find the entry that relates to Zach and return that back. Okay, you don't have to give it a path. It knows where to find passwd. And we can do the same thing with Shadow, assuming that we're an admin. So I'm going to sudo that one. And so it will reach in there and return Zach's row. Or we can go a step further and do the group folder. And so maybe I want to find out about the group marketing, right? And so we can run that and it returns that line too, all right? So instead of having to sift through some big giant file or fire up grep and do a grep search through it, write a regular expression, whatever it is, I can just do it this way. Now, honestly, a lot of times I kind of forget about the getEnt command. It's useful, but if you're comfortable with grep, you can always just do it that way. For example, I might do a cat /etc/passwd and pipe that into the grep command looking for Zach, right? Doesn't quite roll off the tongue, but when you do it, I get the entry right there and I see the information. If I had done getEnt passwd Zach, it would have returned the same exact thing. Well, without the little red coloring, right? Same output. If you're comfortable with grep, if you're comfortable with piping and all that stuff, it's the same result. So getEnt really is kind of like almost like an alias. It is its own utility, but it's almost like an alias of grep, and then it shortens things up so you can jump right in, find exactly what you need, and get those results back out. Another way we can kind of manipulate this a little bit is if we do a getEnt on group and we search for a user, notice that it just finds the primary group that's actually called Zach. It doesn't find all the other groups that Zach happens to be a part of, versus if I had done the longer form of it and done cat /etc/group, pipe that into grep and looked for Zach this way, not only would I've gotten the primary group for him, I would have gotten every group that he's a member of. And in my opinion, that's a little bit more useful. So the command is harder to type, but we can actually find a lot more that's tied to it this way. Now, honestly, I could have got the same output just by typing groups Zach, and then I would have known the groups that he was in, right? So it just depends on what it is you're trying to find. These are all different ways to verify that the group is set up properly and that it's got the users inside of it.
Awesome. Managing Groups, another fantastic episode inside of CompTIA Linux Plus. And before we move to another episode, Don, anything else you'd like to say?
Sure. You might be asking yourself, hey, Don, you created all these groups, but what do they do?
Hey, Don, you created all these groups, but what do they do?
And the short answer, they don't do anything right now. The whole point of having groups is that we assign permissions to them. So stay tuned because we're going to have an episode on permissions, file permissions inside of Linux. And that's where we'll assign permissions to our various groups and where that new GRP, that new group command comes in really handy so you can switch context and gain access to the files that you're supposed to have access to. So that's all coming down the line. Look for that episode. It'll be called File Permissions.
Even more reason to watch every single episode of CompTIA Linux Plus. You'll be so glad you did when that exam comes rolling around, and it will. It's inevitable. Don't forget about our supplementary information that's in the course library, and it's there to do one thing, help you be even more successful. So check that out too. And tell everybody you know about IT Pro TV. IT Pro TV is binge-worthy. Thanks for watching. I'm Zach Memis.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
We will see you again soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.